Welcome to CT's Histories. Today we're going to have a little bit of fun. I make a lot of historic clothing. I order most of my fabrics in, and when you cut them out and you assemble them and you get some nice looking clothes like this, that's all well and fine. But what do you do with all that scrap fabric? It's always left over. So what do you do with it? Well, I throw nothing away. And one of the great things you can do when you're doing historic clothing is you can actually utilize those scraps. And today we're going to talk about two vests that I made from two different periods, and they used very narrow strips of scrap fabric sewn together to create the vests. First up is this mid 19th century vest. It's typical of your Civil War period. It's a civilian cut. The main difference is that I used the scrap fabric from Ben Tart's scrap jean cloth box and sewed them into strips. You can get that scrap fabric. Mostly people use it for making hats, but you can get those boxes from Ben Tart relatively inexpensively, and there is actually a lot of fabric in there. It's just they're odd pieces, and nobody ever knows quite what to do with them other than making a cappy or two. But in this case, what I did is I sewed them into long strips, and then I sewed the strips together to form a length of fabric and then cut out vest fronts. This is actually quite period. People didn't waste stuff like that back then. You'll notice, although this is many strips sewn together, only the shawl collar and the bottom edge look like they're separate strips, and that's because they were cut slightly at a different angle. And here's the front. You can see looks like your normal vest. It's just made out of scrap fabric. This was a very cost efficient. If you have the time to sew, this was very cost efficient. You just sew your scrap pieces together. It actually looks pretty nice. This typical vest front with your darts and your pocket welts. Fully functional vest. And here's a close-up of that shawl style collar, pretty typical of a civilian vest of the period. This vest is actually cut a little bit high, and it's quite heavy with the cotton duck lining and the jean cloth itself. It'd be a good winter vest, but it's pretty typical of the period. The buttons are just real simple coin style buttons. At one time they may have been actually cloth covered, but I think they're just your standard coin style buttons. The lining and the back of this vest are made from a cotton duck bag. Actually, they're just old bags that I had sitting around that were wearing out, and there were good enough sections where the fabric was still in good shape, and I didn't want it to go to waste. However, although I'm reusing fabrics and getting the most out of my scrap fabrics, I'm still putting in the work. You'll see here that it still is all hand sewn, and this is a nice running stitch securing the facing to the lining. The second project I made in similar fashion was this mid 18th century, mid 1750s, say, uh, waistcoat. It's a little bit longer cut, just pre-American Revolutionary War style. And it too was made from splicing or piecing strips of scrap fabric together. It's your typical waistcoat of that period. It's a 4-panel waistcoat, no collar. It does have working pockets, and you'll see on the close-up picture here the actual strips, how they're sewn together. And people did this back then. It was a good way of reusing scrap fabric. This fabric actually came from a ruined lady's wool coat from the second-hand store. It was too small of pieces to actually use for most things, so I cut it into strips, sewed the pieces together, and I had a length of fabric large enough to make this waistcoat. Pocket flaps are quite simple. They're just your typical layered pocket flaps like that. Running stitch of hand stitching around the edge, and then sewn right onto the body panel. The pockets themselves are actually just simple slit pockets let into the lining. So I can actually change out the styling and the color of these pocket flaps if I wanted to. And here you see the back of the waistcoat. This is actually a chunk of, I think it's a linen twill weave. It was from an old bag. You can see it is kind of worn, but the fabric itself was in good shape. It was solid fabric, so I just reused it for the back. The inside of the vest or the waistcoat is made up of more of that black linen, I think, twill, and it has very wide facings, and I cut them that way because I did actually have enough of that twill fabric on hand. However, you'll also note that the lining itself is a very nice shirting fabric I used. It's called fustian, and it's a cotton and linen blend. And I used it on a shirt project, but I had just enough left over where there's enough for this little bit of lining. So there you go, one very cost-effective mid 1700 style waistcoat. I scavenged the buttons from other projects. They're just old military buttons from the 18th century, and yeah, you can see that all the exposed stitching is done by hand. It looks very nice, and it's very usable. This is the type of stuff people would have done back then, particularly your poor and your working class folks. They didn't throw stuff away. If you like my projects, you can catch up with me at Corey's Trading Post on Facebook. If you want to experiment with your own jean cloth projects, you can check out bnbtart.com. They have pretty decent prices on their jean cloth, and all of their stuff is very excellent. And don't forget to check out my historical card models. Most of them are Civil War period ironclads. You can check them out at ecardmodels.com. You can also check them out at Paper Modelers, as well as Models and More. So thank you very much.